Welcome to Chapter 6. In this chapter, we take a look at the different types of business entities. That is, when you start a business, you have to decide how you're going to legally form your business. So that's what we're going to do. One of the things I'd ask you to do at this point is start thinking about the type of business you might be interested in starting yourself. Is it going to be a sole proprietorship? If it's maybe a really small business, that might be a good option, right? If it's just you doing something. Maybe you want to start a business with some partners. Start a business that way. Well, there are different types of partnerships that are available. Or maybe it would be better for your business if you were to incorporate, become a corporation. And there's several different kinds of corporations as well. So let's start moving through these, and it'll give you some good information about how you would choose to start a business, or it'll also make you more aware of the types of businesses you may be working for. So we'll talk about the basic forms of business ownership. We'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of all the different types. So sole proprietorships, partnerships, corporations, and then we'll get into some of the different types of businesses, some of the hybrids, like the limited liability company, some of the different types of partnerships, and then we'll finish out with franchising. One thing before we jump in, by the way, that I wanted to show you just real quick is that you can always get some information on what it takes to form a type of business within each state, usually by going to the Secretary of State website for a given state. For example, this is Texas, so it will tell you, it'll give you some information about the different types of business structures, and it'll give you some guidelines on what is necessary to legally start a business in one of these configurations or change a business into one of these configurations. That's a good point, by the way. Just because you may start out as a sole proprietorship, but as your business grows, you may want to take on partners. So you may want to look at changing to a general partnership or some other kind of partnership. And maybe at some point you decide that a corporation would be advantageous for you. So just wanted to throw that out, that there are different types of business entities that you can choose from, and you can get information usually from the Secretary of State for a given state. All right, so let's start off with we're going to just kind of give you an overview of some of these different business types, and then we'll dig in a little more detail as we go. So there's a sole proprietorship. It's a single owner, right? There are partnerships, and there are different kinds of partnerships. The general partnership is the main type, the most common type. In a general partnership, all partners are going to take an active role in managing the business, and all partners have unlimited liability. Now, there's a concept that I want you guys to be sure you guys are clear on. Unlimited liability in a sole proprietorship, you would have unliability for the debts of the business. That is, if you can't pay your business's bills out of your business checking account, for example, creditors can come after your personal assets because you have unlimited liability. Same with the general partnership. The general partners have unlimited liability for the debts of the business. So if the company gets sued or just can't pay its bills, what have you, creditors can come after their personal assets. Okay, so that's what unlimited liability means. Okay, then of course we have corporations. And by the way, there's a pretty good video in MindTap about corporations, but it's interesting that a corporation is actually a legal entity that is capable itself of entering into contracts. A corporation can get sued. It can sue others. So just understand what we mean, that it is a legal entity of itself. And it's legal and separate from its owners. Now, who are the owners of a corporation? Well, it's the stockholders or shareholders. In other words, the people who own stock in a company are partial owners of that company. They own a piece of ownership. So, however, in a corporation, unlike a sole proprietorship and a partnership, the owners of a corporation have limited liability. That means they're only their loss is limited only to the amount that they have invested in the company. So for a corporation, the most basic type of ownership in a corporation is common stock. So if you or I buy a share of Microsoft, let's say, which is easy to do, right? You can get online and open up a trading account. You could buy a share of Microsoft. If something happened to Microsoft, they really fell on hard times over the years and eventually couldn't pay their bills. If you own that one share of stock, can creditors come after you? No. Because you have limited liability. Now, what money could you lose? Only the money that you invested in that share of stock. So if you paid $300 for that share of Microsoft stock and they went under, well, you could lose your $300. So you have limited liability. Okay? Now, becoming a corporation is a lot more complicated, obviously, than starting other forms of business. You have to file articles of incorporation. You have to establish bylaws. There's a whole plethora of things that you have to do when you start a corporation. But again, it can be a great vehicle. And we'll dive into this a little bit more, some of the advantages and disadvantages of operating as a corporation. All right, there's this other animal called a limited liability company. It's kind of essentially it's a hybrid form of ownership because it's got some elements of a corporation and some elements of a partnership. In fact, you can choose to be, as an LLC, you can choose to be taxed as either one, a partnership or a corporation. You've got some tax pass-through. In other words, you can if you're a single owner LLC, by the way, which is legal in most states, including Texas, you can simply be taxed as an individual. That's possible too. And so that is, your business wouldn't actually pay taxes, but you would, because it's assumed that as a single owner of that LLC, that you would be spending its profits. So you would be taxed on profit on the company, the money that the company makes. Okay? So it's got a lot of flexibility. All right, so let's look at some of the pros. Let's dig into each one of these in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let's look at that sole proprietorship. One, it's pretty easy to form. You could get online in an afternoon and do all the paperwork necessary to establish yourself as a sole proprietorship business. Get yourself a federal tax ID, file with the state, file with the county, a little bit of paperwork with each one, but bing, bang, boom, couple hours, 3 hours, you can make it happen. It's not that difficult. Plus, you're in control, right? As a sole proprietor, if you are the sole proprietor, you can make all the decisions. You have the pride of ownership because, you're building something by the sweat of your own brow. You can choose to spend the profits any way you want, of course. And again, you can get that tax pass-through, right? You're not double taxed because those taxes can be passed through the business to you, meaning, hey, the income of the business is just treated as your personal income, and you pay taxes on it. Or if your business makes a loss for the year, the company loses money, you can actually write off a percentage of those losses against your personal income taxes. So there's that. Now, on the negative side, however, it can be a little bit, scary because you have unlimited liability. That is, if the company gets sued, that means you are getting sued. Your personal assets are in danger. If your business can't pay its bills, that means they're going to come after your personal assets. They come after your car, your boat, all kinds of assets, right? So that's a little bit scary. It can be harder to get financing also because so many, I'm not trying to discourage anyone, but so many sole proprietorships go under that it can be hard to get financing. Banks can be a little bit leery about loaning to sole proprietors. Now, as we're talking about this, you may be thinking that sole proprietorships mean it's only one person in the company. That's not necessarily true. Now, a lot of sole proprietorships are just that, a sole one-person business. But what it actually means is that one person owns the business. There are sole proprietorships that operate with hundreds of employees. Now, I think that's insane to do that, but it's possible. It's legal. You can do that. I definitely wouldn't advise that, but it's possible and it's legal. So it can be harder to get financing. It may be harder to get the really talented people because, again, most sole proprietorships are very small businesses that can't afford to pay the big money. Plus, as a small business sole owner, you're probably going to be wearing a lot of hats. If somebody calls and asks for the president, you're going to proudly say, speaking. But if they ask for the janitor, you're also going to have to say, speaking, right? You have to wear a lot of hats. So that's just the nature of the beast. And what we mean by lack of permanence is that if you register a business as a sole proprietorship and you leave the business, or you are ill, or you die, the business legally ceases to exist. And so that can cause all kinds of problems. Now, you can leave provisions in your will to pass it on to somebody else, but it would still have to redo the paperwork as this new owner, whoever it may you leave it to, for example. So there is a lack of permanence. Yet another reason banks are often leery about extending loans. Okay, let's talk about partnerships. So partnerships, essentially, it's you and at least you and one other person enter into a voluntary agreement to form a business, right? Now, one thing that's critically important is that you have, when you enter into a partnership, you have a really, really detailed partnership agreement. And it needs to spell out, who's contributing what, who's going to do what, and who's going to work, how many hours, how are you going to share the profits and losses, how are you going to settle disagreements, what happens if one of the partners wants out or dies. Now this just sounds like it's just legal mumbo jumbo. Think about all the problems that can happen during without a really detailed partnership agreement. For example, let's say that one person puts in 80% of the startup funds. Would they still want to, with the other partner that put in 20%? Now, would you then want to divvy up the profits 50-50? Of course not, right? One put in a lot more than the other. Well, what if the numbers were a little bit closer to equal, but one of the owners was working the business like 60 hours a week and the other one was rolling in 10 hours a week? And then how do you divvy up the profits? Yeah, and by the way, what if there was a loss, right? It's kind of the same thing. And now, what if the partners get into a disagreement? How are you going to settle it? Are you going to go straight to everybody lawyers up and makes a big, expensive, protracted legal battle that could bankrupt the company and each other? Or are you going to go through arbitration first, which is essentially an arbiter, by the way, is a trained professional who's trained in settling disagreements. And you can have binding arbitration, meaning we go through this process and whatever comes out of it, we agree to abide by it. Or you could have non-binding arbitration, which says, well, we'll give it a shot. And if it doesn't work, then we lawyer up. But as you can imagine, it can get ugly. What if one of the partners leaves? Here's a test question answer for you, by the way. If one of the partners in a general partnership leaves or dies, officially the partnership ceases to exist and you have to restructure all over again. So, and by the way, what if one of the partners simply doesn't want to do it anymore? They want out. How are they going to get paid out? There's a lot of ways to do it. Now, if that's not spelled out in the partnership agreement up front, it can get really ugly. It can even destroy the business. Because one of the partners, if you simply said, well, we'll just figure out how much the business is worth, and somebody that wants out gets that amount of money, a percentage of the value of the business. Probably a bad idea, because most businesses are rolling in their profits, reinvesting them back into the business. As you can imagine, if a business is really trying to grow, it's reinvesting all its profits, it's not going to have a lot of cash. So if one of the business might officially on paper be worth $1 million, but if one of, say, 3 partners up and says, hey, on paper this is worth $1 million, I want $333,000, and then I'll leave. The other 2 partners are going to go, oh my gosh, we can't afford that. Are you crazy? And we put the business out of business. So maybe up front you say, hey, if you want out, you're limited to X amount of dollars. Maybe it's a percentage of maybe it's the amount of money they invested on the front end plus X amount of money, or a certain percentage of the last year of profits, or some number. But you want to be careful and make sure all that stuff is spelled out. And as you can imagine, the higher number of partners that a partnership has, a general partnership has, the more complicated this all is. So I highly, highly recommend that anytime you start a partnership, whether it's with your best friends or family, or risky, no matter who it is though, get a lawyer to help you guys draw up the partnership agreement and make sure that all bases are covered. Okay? All right. Let's dig into this just a little bit. One of the cool things about a partnership is simply the fact that you can pool a lot of financial resources. In other words, it's easier to get financing if it's no longer based on just one person's credit history, work experience, skills, resume, all that kind of stuff. And having more partners gives you a better chance of getting access to loans. You can also capitalize on, you don't have to rely on just one person's set of skills and abilities. Now you can hopefully seek out partners that have complementary skills. In other words, if I'm not an accountant, maybe I'm an operations guy or a marketing guy or what have you, then there's some other key areas that I probably want to seek out partners with that have other types of skills, right? So just being able to kind of build a central cadre of key skills and abilities is a really good idea. Now, partnerships usually are not that difficult to form. There are some tax advantages. Taxing is relatively simple. We'll talk about that here in a little bit more detail in a minute. Now, again, though, on the con side of this, all the general partners still have unlimited liability, meaning they're all still liable completely for the debts of the business. As I mentioned earlier, there's a big potential for disagreements. A lot of relationships are completely destroyed by partnership disagreements. There is a lack of continuity, as I mentioned. If one of the partners leaves, it officially dissolves the business entity and has to reform with the new partners or the partners that are left. And you know, it can be difficult. There can be cause a lot of problems. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some different types of partnerships. One is a limited partnership. A limited partnership has to have at least one general partner, meaning that has unlimited liability, and at least one limited partner, that is a silent partner, somebody who does not actively engage in management of the company. So here's an example of a limited partnership. If you wanted to start a business, you are passionate about, I don't know, whatever your passion is, right? You want to start a business doing that thing, but you just don't have enough money. So if your grandmother said, you know what, sweetheart, I will loan you $25,000 to get this business going. I believe in you, but I don't want to have anything to do with the business. So you would be the general partner. Your grandmother, in this case, would be the limited partner or silent partner, right? As long as she did not participate in managing the business, she would have limited liability, meaning she would be limited to losing only that $25,000. That's all she could lose. Creditors could not come after your grandmother, but they could come after you because you are the general partner. And then there are also limited liability companies. Now, those are typically limited to certain types of professional services, like accountant firms, attorneys, architects, dentists, doctors, different professional services companies like that. Now, the personal assets of the partners in an LLP typically cannot be used to satisfy business debts and liabilities. Now, the LLP does not shield partners from liability for their personal acts. In other words, the LLP cannot limit the liabilities of owners for malpractice. So it can limit their liability for normal operation of business, but if there is proven malpractice involved, then that limited liability goes away. So that's an important distinction to think about. One of the activities I typically have my in-class students follow is an exercise where I ask them to imagine what type of business that they might form with 3 or 4 other partners. And then to kind of go through this exercise of deciding, well, based on my own skills and abilities, who would do what? And who would work maybe what number of hours? Are there things that between the 5 of you, there are some holes in activity or skills? So what things might you outsource? For example, a lot of small businesses, at least initially, will outsource legal, right? They'll contact an attorney that works for themselves or as part of a separate business, attorney fee, for an attorney fee, or maybe accounting. A lot of small businesses start out by hiring an outside consultant to do their account, set up their books for them, and then maybe even they use bookkeeping service that keeps their accounting their books nice and neat and orderly every month. Now, having said that, by the way, you need to be involved as any of the partners need to understand the books of your business and in order to manage it effectively. So we'll get into that, more of that a little bit more later on in the course. But just some things to think about. Again, partnerships can get extremely complex. So again, consult an attorney, get a really, really detailed partnership agreement set up. All right, let's talk about corporations. By the way, if someone starts talking about it, and this is a test answer, by the way, If somebody starts talking about a corporation and doesn't say which kind of corporation is, they mean a C corp. That's what they mean. Okay, so again, remember we talked just a few minutes ago about what a corporation is, how it is owned, right? So you incorporate and you sell shares of ownership in that business, and those become the owners of the business. So if you start a business and you decide to go public, right? Meaning you're going to do an initial public offering, you're going to sell shares of ownership, you're probably going to keep a bunch of those shares up front that you designate as your own. The original owners normally do that. But you'd sell shares, additional shares of ownership in the business. All of those people, including you, if you have some of those shares, are called stockholders or shareholders. And you have limited liability as far as the debts of the business. In other words, the company itself is liable for its debts. But all of the owners, the shareholders or AKA stockholders, they have limited liability. They can only lose the amount of money that they use to purchase that stock. That's all they can lose. But starting a corporation, it involves a lot of paperwork. It's typically, for a big company, it's a big company, mind you, it's incredibly expensive. It involves a lot of paperwork, a ton of paperwork. That requires a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas. So for a larger business to become a corporation, it's a very expensive and complex deal. Now, you can get online and get a lot of advice. There are companies, in fact, I'll show you real quick. There are companies out there that will help businesses incorporate or form in any type of business entity they choose. For example, if you wanted to form an LLC in Texas, you could simply Google that. And there are a million businesses out there that help people walk through the process. Here are some that I found a few minutes ago. WK is one. So you could put in, what kind of business do you want entity are you interested in forming? It will tell you kind of the differences, the pros and cons of each one. Of course, for a fee. Inc. Authority is another one. It will ask you, what is it you want to do, what kind of business, and it'll give you all kinds of extra services that they offer, help you with all the paperwork you have to file, etc. Let's see. This is an example of some of the simple ones, right? Now this makes it seem really simple, but again, the bigger the company, the more complicated all this stuff can be. So you can go into a million different companies that help you with these things. But again, depending on the type of business that you are trying to start, there are companies out there that can help you with it. So C Corporation, you have to file with the state. You have to have federal tax ID, obviously, your articles of incorporation, your corporate bylaws. You have to identify who your officers are. Now, some of your stockholders may be institutional investors, meaning like that could be investment firms, for example, a variety of different insurance companies. It could be a bank. It can be, that's what an institutional investor is. By the way, before I forget, here's another test answer. What state has the highest number of corporate filings? In other words, in what state has the highest number of businesses incorporated? Delaware. Huh. Who would have? I know you're probably guessing Texas or California or New York. Nope. States essentially compete with each other and try to offer really good deals on ease of formation on their regulations and their fees and taxes. So Delaware has very, very favorable rates and regulations, so a lot of companies incorporate there, even if they don't actually do much business there at all. So you could be in Texas and file in Delaware. Now, here in Texas, I will tell you that Texas is very business friendly, and so I probably wouldn't be worth it here in Texas. But so institutional investors can be some of those stockholders in the C Corp. The most basic type of ownership is called common stock. And we'll get into the different types of stock a little bit later, but for this chapter, mostly just know that the most common type of ownership in a C Corp is common stock. Okay. Now, this section just kind of covers a little bit about kind of how corporations are governed. So at the top of the food chain of a corporation is a board of directors. A board of directors is elected by all the shareholders. Now, typically 1 share of stock equals 1 vote. So if you own 5,000 shares of stock in a corporation, you get 5,000 votes. So if you really start thinking about it, a lot of times the board of directors are elected by themselves. In other words, hey, if you own 500,000 shares of some giant corporation, that might be enough votes. You could vote for yourself. You could elect yourself to the board of directors. But anyway, the idea of the board of directors is that they represent the interests of the shareholders, and they ensure that the CEO is making sound business decisions that are going to give all the shareholders a good return on their investment. They do not, however, usually participate in the day-to-day operation of the company. The CEO does that, okay? The CEO reports to the board of directors. And then the CEO manages all those people underneath them, all the vice presidents, etc. Okay? Now, let's get into some of the advantages. So we've talked about the fact that corporations offer limited liability to its owners, who are shareholders or stockholders, same thing. There's permanence because any owner can transfer their shares, in other words, their stock, to another shareholder very easily. And how that works. Let's say that you get online this afternoon, you establish an account so that you can buy some stock in any company. Let's say you buy a share of Amazon stock. You may hold it for a while, maybe you earn some dividends each year on it, and then at some point you decide you're going to do something else with your money, so you can get on that thing, any trading website, and you could sell your share and somebody else will buy it. So that usually you removed yourself from ownership of that company and somebody else took your share. So in other words, there's a lot of permanence because ownership can change hands very, very easily. So there's a great deal of permanence. And by the way, do you understand? I want to make sure you understand why companies would sell shares of ownership. Why would you give away pieces of ownership in your company? Well, you would do that to raise money. Let's say that you own ABC Corporation, and I buy 500 shares of stock in your company. Well, I'm gonna pay you money for each of those shares that you can use to grow that business. But in exchange, as an investor, I want to get a return on my shares of stock. So I'm looking for you to pay me maybe a dividend each year. You don't have to, but I'm hoping you're going to pay me a dividend on each one of those shares each year. And I'm hoping to get a capital gain on that share of stock. In other words, I might buy that share of stock at $10 a share, and if the business is managed very well, and does well financially, the value of each of those shares of stock will go up. So maybe you bought it at $10 a share, and after a few years, those shares are worth $25 per share. You could share your stock and you pocket the difference, right? You made a profit. That is called a capital gain, by the way, which you have to pay taxes on. That's another topic. All right, so transfer of ownership is very easy. Get on this stock market, and you can trade things back and forth. There's apps that you can use and do it very easily with your phone. But it allows corporations to raise money. That's why they sell shares of stock. And by the way, corporations can usually afford to pay big bucks for the absolute best talent out there. So they have very talented, or should have very talented management. All right, now on the negative side, something I call, well, the cost can be incredibly high. Just because of the complexity involved. I mean, the fees themselves may not be that exorbitant, but again, with a large organization, considering you have to pay so many experts, it can be incredibly expensive, especially to do an initial public offering. Then you're dealing with, it's almost always that you're working through an investment banking firm that specializes in doing those, and we're talking about huge bucks. So very, very expensive, very, very complicated to form a large corporation anyway. Now, also when you're operating between different states, there's paperwork that you have to establish in each state that you're doing business in. This whole idea of double taxation is a bummer, because essentially the corporation pays corporate taxes, and then for all the owners, so that money is taxed once, right, through the corporate tax, but then as dividends are paid out to shareholders, those dividends are taxed at the individual level. So that's the second tax, right? So the corporation pays taxes, it's corporate taxes, and then the shareholders, they pay taxes on all the dividends they get for each of the shares of stock that they own. So double taxation is a bummer. A lot of paperwork, a lot of regulation. With regard, what we mean by less secrecy, as a corporation, you have to file an annual report with the SEC, and that becomes the Securities and Exchange Commission. And those filings become public record. So your competitors can read all about what you're doing. They can look at your financials. It becomes publicly available information. So your secrecy goes right out the window. Now, not to say that you still don't have trade secrets. You certainly will. You don't have to spell all of those out in your annual reports, but a lot of your information is going to become public. So some issues there. And there can be conflicts of interest. For example, sometimes corporate CEOs may be paid based on increases in stock price. Maybe they get a huge bonus if the price of the company's stock goes up. So, they might say, hey, let's cut a whole bunch of our costs this year to make us seem really profitable this year, and I'll get a huge bonus. But maybe that hurts the company. Some of those cuts hurt the company in the long term. So there can be a conflict of interest between how corporate executives are paid versus the long-term health of the company. So boards of directors have to be very careful about how they structure executive pay and try to minimize that conflict of interest as much as possible. Now, there's a couple of other kinds of corporations we'll talk about briefly. One is the S Corp or subchapter corporation. Essentially, it's a kind of corporation that meets some very specific IRS requirements. Essentially, that gives a corporation with a company with 100 shareholders or less. It gives them the ability to benefit from several different, it makes it a lot easier for them to operate. They can be taxed as a partnership, for example. The corporation may pass income directly through the shareholders and thus be able to avoid that double taxation. Some of the requirements, though, on that S corporation, it must be a domestic corporation. It's got to have less than 100 shareholders, and it can only issue one type of stock, one class of stock. Okay. Now, some of the disadvantages too, because S corporations can disguise salaries as corporate distributions to avoid paying payroll taxes. The IRS really scrutinizes how these S corporations pay their employees. So an S corporation has got to pay reasonable salaries to their shareholder employees for services rendered before any distributions on stock are paid out. A statutory close organization is it's a special election that corporations, if they have fewer than 50 shareholders, that they can select this. It essentially allows for more flexibility than typically allowed by a regular corporation. Now, statutory close corporations are not even allowed in all states. A lot of times these may be like a family-owned business, for example. So maybe you have a handful of family members and extended family members, a dozen, 2 dozen, and they all own all of the shares of ownership of that company. And they're not allowed to trade those shares outside of the organization. So that can be a good deal for some entities. All right, let's talk a little bit about nonprofits. Now, nonprofits is a special type of corporation that's been organized to meet very specific tax exempt purposes. Now, a nonprofit, just like we studied in chapter 1, is a company who isn't out to make a profit. It's out to serve the public in some way. All right, so to qualify as a nonprofit, the corporation has to be formed to benefit either the public, a specific group of individuals, or just the members of the nonprofit itself. Okay, so I mean, a nonprofit could be a museum, a church, organizations that would maybe an example of one that would benefit its members. The NRA. I'm a member of the NRA. The National Rifle Association. It's formed to benefit its members. So they raise funds through donations of its members and others, and in return they lobby Congress to make laws that benefit the interests of their members. So that would be an advantage there, or an example there. Okay, so here are the basic steps essentially to form a nonprofit. They would file something called a 501c3 corporation. That's a nonprofit. They choose a name, they file articles of incorporation, they apply for an IRS tax exemption, and they apply for a state tax exemption if they're for state tax purposes. They draft bylaws, they appoint directors, on and on. So it's not a super simplified process, although, as I showed you earlier, there are a variety of websites that kind of help walk you through all the paperwork that's necessary. So again, churches, charitable organizations, Mission Waco is another one, the VFW, National Heart Association, the Elks Club, homeowners associations are also usually chartered as nonprofits. Political organizations can be tricky. Credit unions is another one. Okay, so let's say that you have established yourself as a corporation, but you want to restructure your corporation. One way to do it is through an acquisition. Now, an acquisition, that is when you buy another company, right? And just so you know, the acquiring firm is the buyer, and the firm that is purchased is called the target firm. This is usually not a voluntary thing. You're bought because you might think, well, how can you be involuntarily bought? Well, if you're a public company and your shares of stock are available to the public, hey, whoever buys the majority of shares in the company owns that company. So that happens. After the process is over, the target firm, by the way, the target firm ceases to exist. But the acquiring firm continues to trade its stock. That's kind of how that works. Okay, so a merger is when you've got two formerly independent businesses and they combine to form an entirely new organization. Okay, now they could still merge though under the name of the original name of one of those companies, just to be clear. But there's different types of mergers. There are horizontal mergers, which is a merger or consolidation that occurs between companies that operate in the same industry. Often it results in a way, this is usually a way for companies to eliminate competitors. For example, Sprint recently bought T-Mobile. But now this new combined company will be able to better compete against much bigger telecom giants like Verizon and AT&T. A vertical merger is when you have two or more companies involved in different stages of the supply chain process for a common good or service. For example, if a automaker bought a tire company, that would probably reduce their cost of buying tires, right? Because they're not paying a profit margin to a separate company. Now it's their company, so they're not paying a profit margin anymore. They're buying essentially all those tires at cost. See what I mean? They're part of the same vertical supply chain within an industry. And then there's a conglomerate merger. That's when one company buys another company that has absolutely nothing to do with what they do. So like that'd be like if Chevron bought Burger King, right? And there are a lot of conglomerate multinational corporations, by the way, that own all kinds of different things. And the reason companies would, do this type of these types of mergers is because it can offset their losses. They're essentially diversifying, right? So if business in one sector, one industry doesn't do well, hopefully it'll be offset by really great business in another industry. So there's that. All right. And then there's a divestiture, which simply means you're selling off a piece of your company. That's you either totally or partial ownership of some part of your operations. So, all right, that's mergers or restructuring. Let's dig into LLCs just briefly. LLCs can be a really good deal. Most organizers of most LLCs also have which is a limited liability company, right? So you file with the state, you pay your filing fees. You also are going to establish an operating agreement, which are similar to corporate bylaws, and some of them have to also, in some states, you have to file a notice of intent to operate as an LLC. Now, LLCs are neither partnerships nor corporations officially, but they can choose to be taxed typically as either a partnership or a corporation. In fact, if you're a single owner LLC, I owned a business once, and I formed myself into an LLC, so that my taxes I'd get tax pass through from the business directly to myself. In other words, I avoided double taxation in that way and gave myself I limited my own liability in the business. Just some semantics, want to make sure you knew this for the test purposes. Owners of an LLC are called members instead of shareholders or partners. Okay, so some of the pros and cons. Again, you get that limited liability. That's awesome. You have the option to be treated as a corporation or a partnership for tax purposes. You don't have to hold regular board meetings. The owners or members have you can have unlimited number of members. Now, on the negative side of things, okay, so you do have, it can be somewhat complex to form these. You may have to pay additional fees each year. You may have to file additional paperwork to do business in other states. That is, you have to qualify as a foreign entity. And a lot of states don't allow LLCs, at least have limitations on it, such as banks, insurance companies, and nonprofits usually are not allowed to operate as an LLC. Okay, and the last type of business ownership that we'll talk about in this chapter is the franchise. Essentially, a franchise is a licensing agreement, right? You have a franchisor, which is the corporation that owns the franchise, and then they will license out the use of their name, their trademark, their products, their business methods to franchisees. Those franchisees would pay them an upfront fee and then a percentage of sales every month called royalties going forward. Now, there's quite a few, there's a couple of different types of franchise agreements. Really two key, right? The distributorship, that means the franchisor makes the product and the franchisees sell it under that franchisor's name. A lot of the franchises you see are actually business format franchises, meaning it's a whole business system that you're buying. So in other words, if you wanted to open up a Chick-fil-A restaurant, you pay an upfront fee, very, very high fee, a franchise fee, and you agree to operate that business as Chick-fil-A. That's great. Then you pay them royalties. That they give you all kinds of ongoing support and training to make sure that your franchise is a success. So that the franchisor wants to create a win-win, right? They want, if their franchisees are not successful, then they won't be successful. So it's mutually beneficial for them to live up to their promises. Now, here's some things. Some of the trends going on in franchising. Franchising, it makes a lot of sense. Pardon me. Franchises are expanding overseas because, foreign markets might not be as saturated as the markets here in America. For example, here in the United States, there's McDonald's everywhere. Whereas in some other countries, maybe there's not yet. So they're offering franchises in those other countries with less saturated markets. Some other trends, when these businesses operate, well, let's go with McDonald's example. If you look at some of the different types of products that they serve at McDonald's here in America, we're all familiar with the Big Mac, the Quarter Pounder, the fries, desserts. What do they have? They have ice cream and like chocolate chip cookies or something like that, and the apple pie, for example, here in the United States. In other countries, they may have entirely some of those products, but they may have some other products that are entirely different to suit the tastes in other countries. So just be aware of that. If you go into a franchise, McDonald's or some other franchise overseas, you may see some completely different products. Women own nearly half of all franchises these days, and that is growing. Minority participation so far has been relatively low, but some efforts by different groups are trying to change that. So that's a positive trend. Hopefully that is beginning there. Now, some pros and cons franchises. Now, on the one hand, there's less risk because you're following you get instant brand recognition. So you're starting off with an advantage over brand new startups, right? You're starting off being able to be recognized as a McDonald's or whatever franchise, right? There's less risk because you're using a proven business model, a proven way of doing business. I'm going with the McDonald's example. They've been operating McDonald's successfully for decades and decades, and then every year it's improved. How those business models are improved, so it's less risky for the franchisee. Franchisees get ongoing training, ongoing support. That's a huge thing. It's easier because they're a lot less risky. It's easier to get funding. So it's a lot easier to get a bank loan, for example, for a franchise that is successful and established, because they have a much greater chance of succeeding. Now, on the negative side, they can be incredibly expensive. If you take a look at Exhibit 6.7, this is in your book, that's franchise costs. Now, the initial franchise fee, a lot of these don't seem that high. And you look at the royalties, the monthly royalties that you pay, usually monthly. It's a percentage of total sales. That's not net sales. That's usually total sales or gross sales. But also look at the startup costs, as in to actually get going. Anytime Fitness, that's a pretty small gym franchise, right? To open one up, that's what I owned, by the way. It wasn't an Anytime Fitness, it was one similar. The original owner of that franchise paid $250,000 to open the doors of that place. So it can be really expensive. In fact, I mentioned Chick-fil-A a second ago. For Chick-fil-A to eat, it may cost a couple of $1 million to open up one of their locations. So startup costs can be substantial. By the way, there's a lack of control because when you buy a franchise, part of the franchise agreement is that you agree to run that operation their way because you're representing their name. So it really kind of makes sense. So you couldn't just on your own decide to change the logo, change the colors of the restaurant, put up whatever, experiment with new products and services. I'm using a lot of restaurants as examples. There are hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of other types of franchises available that are not restaurants. Now, there's something called a negative halo effect, which essentially just means that if something bad happens at one of the franchises somewhere, it could negatively impact the franchisor, and even other franchisees, right? At places that had nothing to do with it at all. So that's a possibility. Make sure you know that for the test purposes, by the way, what negative halo effect is. And there can be growth challenges simply because the franchise agreements typically restrict the franchisee's territory. Of course, you can buy more than one location. You can more and more franchises actually require new owners to agree to buy 3 or 4 or 5 locations over so many years. So anyway, they can restrict your your territory. You can't just sell a franchise without approval, and you're going to have to pay a pretty substantial franchise transfer fee. And then poor execution. Not all franchisors provide the high level of training and support they say that they're going to. So that can cause problems. Also, some franchisors aren't as selective about franchisees as they should be. And so the negative halo effect, a poor operation of poor management of one of those franchises can hurt the company and other franchisees. So this is all this stuff is spelled out in something called a franchise agreement, which is that contract between the franchisor and the franchisee. It spells out who's going to do what. What is the franchisor going to do, and what is the franchisee expected to do? This is also spelled out in a document called the franchise disclosure document. And those typically have to be given to a prospective franchisee for at least 14 calendar days before they're allowed to execute the contract. Execute the contract means sign it, make it a legally binding document. But part of those franchise agreements, it's just essentially going to spell out everything to do with the agreement between the franchisor and the franchisee. Franchise, writes the franchises their name, their trademark, their patents, their signage, their logo, all of those things. It talks about what fees are paid and when, what is the nature of the training and support, and then how are they going to operate the business. Franchisees are expected to do a certain number of things every single month. It's coming, we're getting into, say, the holiday season. There's specific marketing things that franchisees are supposed to engage in. They're supposed to manage the operation in a certain way throughout the year also. How are they going to resolve problems between the two, arguments between the two? A lot of times it's binding arbitration. It's cheaper for both sides. And what's the territory going to be like? For example, if you buy a Starbucks franchise, the franchisee would want to be protected by say, hey, at least give me a square block as my territory. Don't allow somebody to open up another Starbucks right across the street. It kind of seems like that's the case. Typically, you have a protected territory of some size. All right, so that is Chapter 6. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and have a great day. That's all I have for you.